Good morning, everybody. And welcome to my favorite show, which I have said about every single show that I've done so far. Okay, because they are all my favorite shows. Now, fair warning, I may say this one more time as people come in, so I got to tell you up front, especially if you have children here. At the end of this, there's one photo. There's one piece of art in here that's iffy for kids, but it is art and it's very educational. So it's up to you if you let your kids stay in here or not. I would have loved my mom if she let me stay in here. Oh, and I'm not kidding. All right, let's see. I always start out by telling some funny stories, some true stories from growing up. How many of you got kids? Raise your hands, come on. How many of you have a son, ladies? Raise your hand. Are you ever going to let your son grow up, or is he always going to be your little baby? He's always going to be your little baby, right? I'm going to be 70 years old. My mom, she just passed away, unfortunately, is 93. When she was in her late 80s, I was lecturing out of town. I live in California, and she lived in Florida on the other coast in the United States. Now, you got to let your little babies grow up. I got a call at my hotel. My wife was in Morocco. She's always with me when I travel. But she went to Morocco with a girlfriend, and I was lecturing alone in San Jose, California. I'm in the hotel 10 minutes before going down to do what I'm doing here right now, and I get a call from my mother from Florida in the hotel. Oh, she knew where I was. Hi, baby, how are you? I'm doing fine, Mom. How'd you know where I was? She goes, what's the difference? What are you doing this weekend? I said, I'm working. I'm out of town. She says, oh. I said, in fact, I got to go. I got 10 minutes. I got to be downstairs and start doing a lecture. She goes, oh, I don't want to keep you in your room. You go down, do your lecture, and I'll call you later. You just go ahead. I said, thank you, bye. She goes, just a second, did you shave? I said, yeah, Mom, I shaved. I really got to go down, okay? She goes, all right, you go ahead. Did you have a nice shirt and a clean tie? I said, yes, Mom. Did you brush your hair? Both of them. She goes, is your fly up? Is your fly up? I said, what are you doing, my fly up? What are you doing, reading off a list? And guess what she said? As a matter of fact, before Janae left for Morocco, she mailed me a list. I'm supposed to call you every morning when she's out of town before you go out in public. That's her standing right there. She really did that. And people are always saying, boy, you've done a lot of mean stuff to your wife. All right? I don't think any more people came in with kids. She always makes sure, sometimes I peter out in the middle, so she brings me a big bottle of vodka. It's an art show. It's gonna be good. I'll tell you one more quick story. Do you people have Craigslist? Do you have a thing on the computer where you can sell things, you advertise, and then people come and look at them? We have something called Craigslist in the United States. I sell things on eBay all the time. I never sell things on Craigslist because people come to your house. And you never know who's going to come to your house, especially if your wife's home alone or you're home alone for that matter. You can Google this one. This happened last year. There's a plumber in the United States that was about my age, and he retired. And he sold all his company trucks. I'm going to make up the name. Let's say it's Bob's Plumbing. Okay, he sold all of his company trucks, he closed up, and he retired. About 6 months later, he gets a phone call during the news at 6 o'clock at night. His buddy calls him. Al, turn on the TV, turn on CNN. He goes, just turn it on. So he ran, turned it on. Guess what he saw? In the Middle East, driving across the desert, white pickup trucks that said Bob's Plumbing with these ISIS guys with their machine guns on top of them. These people came to his house and bought 4 of his trucks and shipped them over there. Don't sell things on the internet and let people come to your house, guys. Fair warning, that's a true story. Let's get started here. We're going to cover a lot of stuff. I'm going to tell you one more time in case someone else came in with kids. There's an iffy piece of art at the end of this show. It's pretty graphic. If you have children, you may not want them to see it. And as I said earlier, if my mom let me see it, I'd have loved her even more than I do. So, there's fair warning. My name's Stephen Kikowski, and welcome to the show. This is my art show. We will be spending the next 45 minutes or so together, and we're going to be talking about art, the juicy, sexy, scandalous, risque stories behind the scenes of a lot of important artists that we know. All the stuff they couldn't teach in school because you were too little. Now, before we start, I want to remind you, don't forget to get your pin at the end. Some people forget to get their pins and then ask me later. Lady in back will give you a pin afterwards. Don't forget to see Nancy, our ship biologist and naturalist. She's on at 11 o'clock, right upstairs here today, doing an excellent lecture. And lastly, before we begin, I want to tell you I'm doing one more show this afternoon, this one, and either tomorrow or the next day, I'm not sure which day, I will be doing the social media show. The ins and outs of social media, how to use it, more importantly, how to know what your kids and grandkids are doing behind your back. So it is also a fun show. So sit back. I hope we're going to all enjoy this one. How many of you have been to one of my shows? Most everyone, a lot of people haven't. So let me talk about credentials for a second because it's important. People always ask, has this guy been around the block a few times? Does he know what he's talking about? Is he involved in any of this stuff? Is this off the cuff? Well, take a look up on the screen. As you can see, I've been around a little bit more than the block. That is not a bucket list. My wife Janae and I have traveled all over the world for 45 years. For 35 years, we did third world countries, independent travel, sleeping in jungles and fields, really weird stuff. But we saw a lot of the world. Currently, I lecture all over the United States. I also lecture internationally for Carnival Cruise Lines. I've been a regular guest in my country on ABC TV, NBC, the Live Well Network, the Disney Channel, and for those of you who like the Flip This House programs and the decorating programs, I was a designer for 44 and a half years. I was a frequent guest in California on a lot of those shows. On top of that, this is an art show. What qualifies me to talk about art? I'm very interested in art. I've been collecting fine art and antiques for over 50 years. In my collection, I have loaned things to museums around the United States. I also built and own a private museum that's not open to the general public. I built it to do fundraisers for various charities. I can give you a card after if you want to peruse the website. Antique American automobiles, vintage caravans, and everything related. I've also been on radio talk shows, newspaper magazines, I've written a book. So yeah, I've been around the block a little bit more than just a few times. So sit back, you're in for my favorite show. Now we're going to start with art from one of my favorite periods, time in Paris known as La Belle Époque. You like the way I said that? Anyone speak French? La Belle Époque. I don't speak French. And I don't know if I said it right or not, but I have a neighbor who's from Paris. And he tried to teach me how to pronounce everything in this show, and he cracked up every time I pronounce anything. So be kind to me if you speak French. Okay? I'm trying my best. Now, during this La Belle Époque period, painting was changing to creativity and experimentation, a lot of it. It was a time of impressionism. At this time, dance halls, cabarets, the brothels became the main hangouts for all the artist type of the day. Now I'd like to tell you a story that a few people claim is myth. Most people think it's true. As I stated before, the art patrons and the artists hung out at all the cabarets in Paris. Cabarets like the famous Moulin Rouge, which is still there. I took that picture last year. Now in the early days, the dancers worked for tips, all right? Show a little more skin, get a bigger tip. That's what they wanted to do. And they dared to show more and more skin at each and every cabaret trying to get bigger tips. There was a lot of competition going on. Everyone was competing for who could show the most skin to get the bigger tips. Well, why? Because that's where the patrons would flock to, finally. The dancers at the Moulin Rouge figured it out, okay? To get all the tips, and maybe most of the patrons in Paris, because the dancers at the Moulin Rouge took off their panties and started dancing like this, and that's where the can-can started, at the Moulin Rouge. True story, guys. Well, when the Paris Vice Squad, the police department, found out about this, what happened? Bunch of guys, they formed a special unit to check under the dancers' dresses each and every night before each performance. Now, I bet there was a lot of competition there too, and it wasn't for tips. This time the competition was to get on that special police unit. Now here's a Moulin Rouge painted by a very famous artist, Toulouse-Lautrec, and here painted by Vincent van Gogh. Let's go back to Toulouse-Lautrec for a second. Henri Toulouse-Lautrec. This guy, I would say, poor Henri. This guy was only 5'1". He had the adult body from the waist up and a child's body from the waist down. It's a genetic disorder. It's even named after him today. It's called Toulouse-Lautrec syndrome. Now when I say poor Henri, this guy also had underdeveloped genitals, okay? Let me repeat, poor Henri. So what did he do? Well, he was made fun of by everybody, so he immersed himself in his art. And he hung out at the cabarets, mostly at the Moulin Rouge. He painted a lot of advertising posters for the Moulin Rouge. He's very famous for that. Lautrec did many paintings for sale also of the Moulin Rouge. Now he spent most of his time in the brothels. It was here that he was accepted by the prostitutes and the madams, so much so, he would actually move in for weeks at a time. Many of the prostitutes became his models, his best friends. Now, Toulouse-Lautrec was an alcoholic. He drank a lot. He drank absinthe back in the day, along with all of his buddies like Vincent van Gogh and Gauguin, who I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Now, to ensure he was never without alcohol, what did he do? This was good. He booked himself on a bunch of early Carnival cruises and bought a drink package. Okay? No, actually, to ensure he was never without alcohol, what he did is he hollowed out his cane and he filled it with absinthe. And he drank all the time, okay? Poor Henri Toulouse-Lautrec died syphilis when he was only 36 years old. Now, today, his paintings are worth a fortune. In 2005, this painting here sold for $22.5 million. Okay, that's 12 years ago. Now here's somebody you all know, Vincent van Gogh, right? Vincent van Gogh. Wrong. It's not Vincent van Gogh. It's actually Vincent van Gogh. That's how you pronounce his name, Vincent van Gogh. But I'm going to say Van Gogh just so I don't sound foolish up here. Now Van Gogh only painted, believe it or not, for 7 years, from the time he was 29 to when he died at 37. He did not live very long. He expressed his extreme emotions through his color and his brush strokes, okay? He painted with a sense of urgency and exuberance. You can see it in his paintings. He'd often finish a complete painting in just one day, and this guy painted a lot. He did a lot of paintings in a very short period of time. But Van Gogh was a misfit, a total misfit. He was never good at dealing with people. He was never good at making friends. I want you to remember this word because he was really weird. He was really weird. There's some things written about him. In Van Gogh's early days, he was very undecided what he was going to do in life. So he first tried to be an art dealer like his brother Theo, okay? But he wasn't any good. He wasn't any good at being an art dealer because he was not good with people and he was so weird. When this failed, when he failed as an art dealer, he moved to Belgium. Why did he move to Belgium? Because he figured, well, I can't be like my brother, I'll be a missionary like my father. Well, Van Gogh is also a womanizer, and let me tell you, a womanizer and a missionary don't go together, all right? I think he was in the mission position too much to be a missionary, all right? It's been written that Van Gogh spent most of his money on prostitutes, sometimes frequenting the local bordello 2-3 times a day. I don't know about you guys, but to me that would be mission impossible. Okay? Having failed as a missionary, what did he do? He moved again. He moved to Antwerp. Now while in school, he did these two paintings. The one on the bottom right is one of my all-time favorites, the Potato Eaters. You got to see that one in person. It's really cool. After school, he moved again. He moved to Paris to live with his brother Theo. Now what did he do? He started hanging out with all the other artists in the cabarets, artists like Toulouse-Lautrec, all Gauguin. He tried selling his paintings. His buddies were selling a lot of paintings. He didn't sell any. Van Gogh never sold anything, zip, Nothing. His friends were having success, and poor Vincent, nothing. It was really discouraging for him. One day, he brought a prostitute to his brother's house. And what did his brother do? He booted him out into the street. That's what he did. What did he do? After that, he moved. This guy moved a lot. This time to the south of France, to the town of Arles. Here, some of the paintings he did of his house, his bedroom. This is where he hung out, the town where he lived. Van Gogh had the intention of starting an artist colony there. Great idea, but you know what? None of the other artists wanted to go down there and live with him, because once again, he really was weird. No one would go. So not long after he moved down there, his friend Gauguin needed some money, wanted to borrow some money, so he went to Vincent's brother Theo. And Theo told him, if you go down and live with my brother and watch over him, I will loan you the money. So he did. Gauguin went down there with a bribe, and he lived with Van Gogh for some money. Well, they didn't get along since Gauguin was extremely arrogant and Van Gogh was so weird. They lived together in this yellow house for only 9 weeks. One day, things came to a head when Gauguin slept with Van Gogh's favorite prostitute. These guys got in a huge fight over that one. You heard it here on Carnival. Van Gogh chased Gauguin with a razor, chased him all over the house, and Gauguin bailed out and he got away. So what did Van Gogh do? He went in the house and hacked off his ear, and he gave it to the prostitute for a present to show his love for her. Here's one to try, guys. Well, the prostitute called the police. They came out, and he was found laying in a puddle of blood. These are some paintings that he did of himself after he hacked his ear off. Now, after this episode, even he thought he was a little weird. So what did he do? This is when he checked himself into a mental clinic. He checked himself into a mental clinic. This is a painting he did of the inside of the clinic while he lived there. Here's a couple more paintings he did while he lived there. His friend Paul Gauguin wrote, and I'm going to quote here, Van Gogh wants nothing but to chase the nurses and sleep with all the patients in here. He washes himself in a filthy coal bucket. He was becoming more weird by the day. Well, guess what? So weird that Van Gogh shot himself at the clinic, and that's where he died. He was only 37 years old. Shot himself, dead at 37, penniless, broke. Van Gogh only sold one painting during his entire short life. It's called The Red Vineyard, and it's hanging in a museum in Moscow right now. But you know what? One of the most expensive paintings ever sold was a Van Gogh. $78 million US, paid by a Japanese businessman. The painting was Dr. Cochet, his doctor. Now this Japanese businessman was even more weird than Van Gogh, because you know why he paid $78 million? Because when he died, he wanted to be cremated with that painting. That's kind of weird. Well, when he died, the painting was seized by the bank. It was seized by the bank to pay off all of his debts. Therefore, the painting was saved from cremation. The bank later sold the paintings, the details were never revealed, and it disappeared. Well, you're all here on Carnival to learn something, right? You heard it right here on Carnival Cruise. That right there is hanging in my house in my own personal collection. You might laugh, but it's actually a photograph done at a copy place on a piece of canvas, but it looks pretty cool. You can do the same. Let's talk about Paul Gauguin for a minute. Paul Gauguin was Van Gogh's really good friend. Gauguin used very bold colors and exaggerated body proportions in his art. He started what's called the primitive style in art. He painted this self-portrait. Must not have thought too much of how he looked. Now, Gauguin was born in Paris. At the young age of 26, he was married with 5 kids already, working as a boring accountant. He was not real happy. He was also a misfit, okay? So what did he do? He was a rebel all of his life, so he too started hanging out at the cabarets with all the other artists of the day, and he took up painting for a hobby. He liked it so much, he left his wife and kids, and then he abandoned his family and he moved to the Caribbean, Tahiti. Next. Gauguin was also an alcoholic. Sound familiar? See a pattern here, guys? Gauguin preferred young girls, really young girls. I have to say, after studying this, he was a pervert. He actually contracted syphilis. Here's some of the paintings that he did while he was in Tahiti. Most people in Tahiti hated him. They really disliked him. Why? Because he was arrogant and domineering, just like Van Gogh was. Let's move on to somebody new. 1900, Paris. A new artist came to town. A new artist. This guy was so poor, he was burning his canvases to stay warm in his room at night. One day he was starving. He stopped at what was a popular cabaret at the time, Air La Pagile, and he ordered onion soup, but he didn't have any money. So he told the waitress, you know what? Check this out. He took a napkin and he did a sketch of her. So I'm going to pay you with a piece of art. And she took it. This guy was smooth. Well, that worked really good. So for the next week, he went every night and sat somewhere else and got a different waitress. And he was eating pretty good until the owner found out. And when the owner found out, he confronted the artist. Did that deter him? No. This guy was persistent. Please, I won't do a sketch for you. I'll do an oil painting on a piece of canvas for you. I'm going to be a famous artist one day, and it'll be worth a lot of money. The guy fell for it. And he ate there that night too. Guess who it was? Picasso. Pablo Picasso. Even after he became famous, he sketched on napkins for payment. And you know what? Everybody was more than happy to take it. Let's talk a little bit about Pablo Picasso. Now, Picasso's father was an art teacher. Very little money, and young Pablo became his father's obsession. His father trained him 8 hours a day, forcing him to draw. Well, at 13, Pablo Picasso was a great realistic painter, not the stuff you see today. Look at the detail in that painting on the left. That's a Picasso when he was 13 years old. Eventually, he ran away from home and he started hanging out with other poor artists like himself in Barcelona. At 18 years old, where did he go? Paris, the artist's Mecca. And he started his blue period of painting. And where did he start hanging out? The cabarets with Van Gogh, Gauguin, Toulouse-Lautrec. Now, Picasso was poor, and people didn't really like his new style. But he refused to change. He was stubborn. And since he had no money, his dad had cut him off due to his rebellion, he was really poor. Soon Picasso started his rose period of painting, okay? He started painting more cheery subjects using brighter colors. At this time, the great American art patron Gertrude Stein started helping him sell some of his work. That's her in the middle. He painted Gertrude Stein. He did this painting during his rose period. Here's a place Picasso lived in Paris for years, 8 years. He turned this building into a successful artist colony. The building still stands today. I took that picture last year. The motto of the day amongst the artists was paint all day and party all night in the cabarets, and these guys lived up to that motto. During the time, he painted one of his most famous paintings. He became overnight from poverty to one of the wealthiest artists who ever lived. But Picasso was also very egotistical and demanding. Things had to be his way or the highway. He had an infamous love life. He had several marriages, multiple affairs. On top of that, he had secret marriages, mistresses. Women even shared this guy. Some of his girlfriends committed suicide, and as he got older, the women got a lot younger. Look at that one. She's 23 years old. It's his last wife. Where's her seeing eye dog? He's 70. The guy's like this short and not much to look at. Let's move on to another famous artist of the day, Claude Monet. I love Claude Monet. Monet had a great technique also. His technique was to paint very rapidly on the spot. Then he would take those paintings back to his studio where he would refine them and finish them. Claude Monet, Monet's cathedral and water lily paintings show his obsession with light and color, not so much the subject matter. He would paint the same subject over and over and over again in different light. Why? The subject wasn't important. The light and the color was. That was his main goal. He'd work for months on the same canvas to give it the impression of a moment in time. And believe it or not, Monet could work on 4 and 5 canvases at one time, sometime during the same day in a studio. That's pretty impressive. In 1872, Monet painted this, Impression Sunrise, and presented it to the critics and to the public. And you know what? They hated it. This is the painting that started the label Impressionism. But at the time, calling a painting impressionistic was not a compliment. The public hated it too. In 1883, he moved. He moved to another part of France, Giverny, outside of Paris with his family. Now this is really cool. Last year, Janae and I visited his house, and I was totally taken back by the enormous, magnificent, beautiful gardens all through the entire piece of property. And a few questions revealed this, something I didn't know and most people don't know. Monet wasn't only an artist, he was an expert botanist. He personally designed and planted everything on his property. Specific plants that he knew in his mind, when they bloomed, he wanted to paint as they matured. That's pretty neat. He even painted the inside of his house with really bright colors from his palette. And what surprised me when I went in the house even more than what I saw outside the house was what was on the walls. Instead of beautiful pieces of art from all his buddies, he had cheap Japanese prints framed all over the place. He hung Japanese prints in every single room. You know when he discovered Japanese prints? When the butcher shop wrapped his fish and his meat in them and sent them home, and he opened them up. Today they're very collectible. He collected them back in the day. Only in his studio did he hang pieces of art that he did or art that other artists did. Nowhere in his house. Monet was moody. Good day, saw him in a good mood. A bad day, a cloudy day, he was mean and depressed. In a depressed state, he could spend 2 or 3 days sitting right there, not talking and not moving. Sound familiar, ladies? When Monet was in his 60s, he started losing his eyesight. He now painted with a lack of detail, and his color was becoming really weird, all wrong. The poor guy had to try to read the labels on the paints to identify the colors. The forms of his water lilies began to fade, too much yellow, too much red. Now my wife and I went to an exhibit of his when we were in Paris. The tour guide, I love tour guides, you know, they got that accent and they kind of think they're really something. Monet was simply changing his style here. God, look at the paintings. I think he was going blind. He wasn't changing his style. Here on the left, a painting of the Japanese footbridge in his garden in his early years. On the right, in what I call his blind years. And here on the left is a painting of Monet's water lilies in his early years, and on the right during his blind years. I think this might be proof that his style change might have been blindness. What do you think? Now, who hasn't heard of Renoir? Another one of my favorite impressionists. You're going to love this one. Renoir was another very famous impressionistic painter who was really good friends with Claude Monet. And here's something most of us don't know. I didn't know this about him. Renoir developed arthritis when he was in his late 50s. And you know how bad it got? It got so bad that he was confined to a wheelchair, he couldn't walk, and his hands were so deformed that his paintbrushes and everything were taped and tied in knots around his fingers. He couldn't hold on to anything, and he was still painting. That's pretty impressive. Here's a couple of his early paintings. Now take a close look at those. Those were when nothing was wrong with him. I've always been impressed with his work. Until I saw this. Take a look at this next slide. I couldn't believe it. Renoir painted this when he was in a wheelchair and he couldn't move. His brushes were wedged between his fingers and wrapped and tied in knots. Look at the detail. It's absolutely phenomenal. So thankful his disability wasn't as drastic as Monet's. He could still paint, and he wasn't changing his style. He was just painting differently. Let's move to some Caribbean artists. One of the most popular ones Excuse me, one of the most popular painting styles in the Caribbean is primitive style of painting. Gauguin was a big influence, I told you that earlier. That's because he painted in Martinique for a while before he went to Tahiti. The primitive painters all use vivid colors and flat perspectives. Now this famous painter is Fernando Botero. Botero's from Colombia, and since Carnival goes to Colombia, I wanted to introduce him to you. Take a look at his stuff. Botero is considered and recognized as the most famous Latin artist who ever lived. His signature style has been given a name. It's called Boteroism. Take a look up there. The artist paints people and figures in large, exaggerated volume, as you can see. Now, I just hope and pray that eating upstairs in the Lido, I don't become Boteroized. Take a look at the guy on the left there. All right? Be careful, guys. Now, Botero's in his 80s now, and each of his paintings sells for millions of dollars. I wonder what's going to happen when this guy croaks. Might be a good investment if you can find one. This is a circus collection started in 2008. Botero's work is even shown in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City and other famous museums all over the world. Are there any famous American artists? Well, believe it or not, yes, there are. Like this guy, James Whistler. I'm going to tell you the rest of the story here. Whistler was an American-born painter, and this very famous painting is commonly referred to as Whistler's mother. Let me tell you the rest of the story about Whistler's mother. Whistler, like other artists of the day, didn't care much for the subject matter. I mentioned that earlier with some other artists. What he wanted to do in his paintings was portray the idea that the black and white shades of black are the fundamental colors. In fact, the original name for this particular painting was Arrangements in Gray and Black No. 1. The original title didn't even mention his mother. Now, why do you think he painted his mother? Guess what? It's not what you think at all. The truth is, his mother was a replacement because the model didn't show up that day. His mother was old. He was going to paint the model standing up. His mother couldn't stand. He said, just sit down and don't move. And that's how he painted her. Whistler's intent from the very beginning was not to paint his mother. Don't forget that. It was just to show style of painting and his color theory. Now, initially, Whistler wanted to show this painting at an exhibition in London, and the critics didn't like it. They rejected it. Finally, they agreed to show it if he changed the name. If you change the name of the painting to Portrait of the Artist's Mother, we'll put it in the exhibit. Well, he didn't want to rename it. That would give emotional feeling to a painting once they knew it was his mother. He wanted the subject anonymous. Remember that. Well, finally, he agreed. Disgustingly, he agreed, and he changed the name of the painting. And guess what? When it got into the exhibit, it was hung in the back in a corner because they still didn't like it. So what did he do? He pawned it. He took it to a pawn shop and he pawned the painting. No sentimental value whatsoever. Well, 20 years after he pawned it, the painting ended up in a museum in Paris. This is when it became very popular with the general public, because they viewed the painting as a loving testament to the artist's mother. Boy, he really didn't want that. The image started to be used as an icon for motherhood, affection for parents, family values. Exactly what Whistler did not want to happen. That's why he got rid of it. For example, United States Post Office put out a stamp, and it was written on there, in honor and memory of the mothers of America. Here's the Mother's Memorial in Ashland, Pennsylvania. Here we have a recruitment poster for Canada, urging men to enlist and fight for your mother. This image has been used in comedy, television, movies, advertising. It's been used for everything, and I'll tell you, he's probably rolling in his grave today. And I assure you, he hasn't stopped rolling yet, because this is now hanging in the Musée d'Orsay, one of the most famous museums in Paris. Let's talk about another famous artist, John Singer Sargent. John Singer Sargent. Sargent was an American artist commissioned by many people, rich people of the day, to do portraits. portraits of all the rich people of his generation. Early in his career, his fame spread, and this guy made a lot of money, plenty of money. This is how he did it. First, he'd negotiate his fees. Each portrait was $130,000 in today's dollars. This is 100 years ago, and you know what? He did 13 a year. That's a lot of money back in the day. 14 a year, actually. Sargent was a very wealthy artist. After he made the arrangements, how much he was going to charge, he would go to the client's house. He'd see where the painting would be hung. Then he'd go in the client's closet and he'd pick out the clothes for the painting. He'd go over the client's wardrobe, clothes, everything. Then he'd take it all back to his studio where he had the correct furniture and settings, and that's where he would do it with his props. Usually 8 to 10 sittings per painting. That's a long time. And he kept a pleasant conversation. Remember, this guy was the most popular artist of his day. He kept up pleasant conversations with his clients. They loved him. Often he'd take a break and play the piano for them. This guy seemed really, really charming, doesn't he? Well, guess what? At 51, he officially stopped painting portraits. Now, why on earth did he do that when he was such a success? Well, I'll tell you, I'm going to quote this too. Painting a portrait would be quite amusing if one were not forced to talk to the client while working. What a nuisance having to entertain the city and look happy when one feels so wretched. I know some of you can relate to that in your own jobs. I think some of the ship staff can relate to that when we might complain to them, so think twice. Actually, one of his first portraits almost ended in total disaster. He painted a Parisian socialite, Madame Pierre Gautreau. She was notorious in Parisian society. She was rumored to be having multiple affairs, although she was married to a prominent rich banker. Madame Gautreau always covered herself with lavender powder. It set her apart from all the other ladies of the day. The painting took an entire year to complete. Gautreau and Sargent were really pleased with it when they were done. Sargent entered this painting in the National Exhibit since he was so proud of it. But you know what? It became a scandal of the day. The plunging neckline was unheard of, all right? One of the straps off of her shoulder. Shocking during that period of time. It was a very conservative, prudish society back then. Gautreau's mother begged him to take the painting out of the exhibit. He wouldn't do it, but what he did do, instead of withdrawing it, he painted the strap back on, and then he changed it, the name, to Madame X, to protect the name of the lady he painted. Years later, Sargent sold his painting to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. It's now considered one of his best paintings ever. Now, I told you that you'd have to sit 8 to 10 times to have your portrait done. That is not as easy as you think, guys. Sitting in the same position multiple times is not a party. Take a look. This is what it's like. It's not easy sitting for an oil painting, everybody. Let's move on. Let's move on to Georgia O'Keeffe, another famous American artist, a female artist. Georgia O'Keeffe has been recognized as the mother of American modernism. Her paintings are in a lot of important museums like the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the MoMA in New York City. She even has a museum dedicated to her in New Mexico. In her younger years, Georgia O'Keeffe was a school teacher in Texas who taught art. But she really wanted to be an artist full time. Well, she was young, she met Alfred Stieglitz, showing him one of her charcoal paintings. At the time, Stieglitz was considered one of the most important people in New York art society. He had a big gallery. He was an internationally acclaimed photographer. Stieglitz and O'Keeffe fell in love. And although she was 28 and he was 52, and married to someone else at the time, he moved her up to New York City, set her up in the studio, and promoted her art in his gallery. And they lived together for about 8 years, and he finally divorced his wife, and he married Georgia O'Keeffe. Now, during this time, O'Keeffe started painting large-scale portraits of flowers at very, very close range, as if seen through a magnifying glass. She became very famous for these paintings. Can you guess why? Take a close look. Come on, guys, you got a memory. All right, to most of the art patrons of the day, and even today, most of us think these flowers look like female genitalia. O'Keeffe denied that to the very end, but she kept painting them anyway. Even in the 70s, when the feminists were celebrating O'Keeffe for her female images, she wanted no part of the celebration. Personally, I agree with the feminists. Soon her work commanded very, very high prices. 6 of O'Keeffe's early calla lily paintings sold for $25,000. At the time, this was the largest sum ever paid for a group of paintings by a living American artist. In the beginning of the relationship, every summer for 11 years, the couple lived with the Stieglitz family at Lake George. O'Keeffe hated it. She had absolutely no privacy. She'd always been a solitary type person. She was constantly, constantly surrounded by his family, driving her nuts. So she started making little trips to New Mexico. While she was gone, she discovered Stieglitz was having multiple affairs. Sound familiar? Well, in the following years, O'Keeffe and Stieglitz remained married, but often lived apart for long periods of time. She had homes in New Mexico until she died. O'Keeffe was always a loner. Now, she didn't only paint those flowers, okay? O'Keeffe, she painted the mountains where she lived in New Mexico, and she became very famous for these paintings also. And I fully understand why, because I recently visited New Mexico, and I went and I saw her homes and her museums, and it is really, truly silent, desolate, peaceful, and absolutely stunning. This painting called Summer Day, she painted it in 1936, is one of her most well-known works. She was an extremely talented and famous artist, and she painted right up until she died at 98 years old. What a great career. Let's take a cruise down to Mexico on Carnival and talk about Diego Rivera. Diego Rivera, another one of my favorites. He's one of the most famous artists from Mexico. Rivera's mainly known for his large, large murals. He started the Mexican muralist movement. Now, he's always been one of my favorites because I grew up in the United States in Detroit, Michigan. And at the Detroit Institute of Arts, there's this massive mural that he did, 1932 to 1933. And it is something to see in person. He painted large, simplified figures in bold colors. And all of his art, all of it told a story. There's political statements and symbolism everywhere. For example, in this mural in Detroit in the 30s, he painted the Ford assembly line where they built cars. He painted a lot of people from all different races. Why? To make a statement about Henry Ford, who only hired white men. Since he was a communist, he usually snuck in a communist statement or two in his murals. This represents the red star and the sickle. There's a lot of political statements and Mexican symbolism in this mural. In fact, during the early 1950s, we had McCarthyism. There was a large sign placed over the murals that they were detestable. Well, thank goodness they didn't destroy the murals, they just hung signs over them. We were lucky in Detroit, but not in New York City. You've all heard of the Rockefellers, right? Rockefeller Center. Diego Rivera painted an enormous mural for Nelson Rockefeller at the New Rockefeller Center in New York City the following year. When the Rockefellers discovered this little picture of Lenin right in the middle, he was told to delete it, and he refused. And guess what the Rockefellers did? They destroyed the entire wall, took down the entire mural, but not before Diego Rivera took pictures of it. And you can actually go to Mexico City today because he repainted it, and you can actually go see what they destroyed. He did many murals in a lot of different parts of the United States, especially San Francisco, California, and New York. When you do tours, you can actually see some of his work. Now this is Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera's wife, another renowned artist, but not while she was alive. Let's talk about Frida Kahlo for a little bit. She met Diego Rivera when she was 22 and he was 42, and still married to his second wife. Sound familiar again? Well, it is. Frida and Diego met when she was an art student. Now, what did she see in this guy? Her nickname for him was Frog Toad. And look at him. It's exactly what he looked like. This reminds me of an ugly old Picasso and his young women, too. Anyway, Diego and Frida's life was a very turbulent story. They both loved the limelight, and their marriage was an open book internationally, and they both had violent tempers. There was a lot of affairs by both of them. Frida had affairs with both men and women. Diego really didn't care about the women, but boy, he was jealous of the other men. He'd often come after him with a pistol. Frida had an affair with Leon Trotsky also. They had arranged for Trotsky to come to Mexico for asylum. And Diego, he had affairs with lots of different women. In fact, they even had threesomes with a frog toad. That's not real inviting. When they were having a fight, Frida would boot him out on the street. Boot him right out of the house. He'd often be seen wandering around the neighborhood until she opened the door for him. And when she did, you could always see a flask of tequila hanging out her back pocket. Frida painted all this drama into her paintings. Frida Kahlo frequently painted about the 2 accidents that left her permanently disabled. She often painted such weird and disturbing paintings that I didn't put any of them in this show. Most of her paintings were mainly self-portraits. I think she may have been a little egotistical. When Frida was in Detroit or New York or traveling around with Diego, she'd often wear really flamboyant Mexican clothes, even though she was usually stared at. Why? To seek attention. You see, Diego was very, very famous. She was not famous yet. This brought attention to her, only Diego. This is how she attracted attention to herself. It wasn't actually until the 70s, when a movie and a biography done about her, that she became famous. At the time, women and feminists were celebrating her life and her art, very similar to other artists like Georgia O'Keeffe. Her paintings started becoming very valuable. This particular one sold for $5.5 million after she died. Even today, you see Frida Kahlo's face in a lot of articles that women buy, their clothing, purses, bags, things like that. Are there any art forgeries out there? Buckle up, guys. You're going to love this. This is a famous painting that a lot of Americans are familiar with. It's done by Gilbert Stuart of George Washington, painted in 1796. Very, very famous painting in my country. It's currently hanging in both the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Well, why is that? Well, this one isn't a forgery because they just share the painting back and forth. However, at one time, there were many, many forged copies of this painting. Let me tell you how it happened. The artist Gilbert Stuart needed money. A sea captain, a buddy of his, John Swords, asked the artist, "Would you paint me a second one of those?" Well, he needed the money, so he made his friend promise. He made Swords promise, "If you promise to never make copies." Now, this was a long time ago, guys. After promising not to do so, what did he do? He took the copy to China and had copies made, 100 of them. Had 100 perfect copies made, then back to America, where he started selling the copies. Well, Gilbert was livid. Gilbert Stuart was really livid. He took the captain to court, and he won, but the damage was done. This was the first major art scam in the United States. And today, art scams are happening all over the world. Tens of millions of dollars of fake art change hands everywhere, all over the world. Thomas Hoving, who used to be the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, claims that 40% of the art in museums today is fake or forged. That's pretty incredible. Jan Walther, this is a better one. The chief of Switzerland's Fine Art Expert Institute claims that 50% of the art on the market today is most likely forged. But you don't have to worry unless you're spending millions of dollars in buying art of a dead artist, originals. The National Gallery in London actually put on a major exhibit showing the public how many times they've been scammed. These are museums. Here's one of the paintings in their collection that they discovered was a fake. An Allegory by Botticelli. Not. It was a fake. Today we can use high-tech science techniques to catch the fakes. Before we had these techniques, the experts were often fooled. And even using the science we have today, the experts are still fooled, since the forgers are so talented. For example, take for example this guy, Beltracci. He made millions and millions of dollars selling fake paintings to a great many museums. Well, he sold this fake painting to Steve Martin, $860,000 bucks. Landschaft Münferden. Guess who I think got the shaft here? Steve Martin. The Metropolitan Museum of Art even had one of its fake Max Ernst paintings hanging in its museum. He sold another fake Max Ernst to another museum for $7 million bucks. He was able to trick everybody for years, even the experts using scientific technology, because he went to antique fairs, street fairs. He bought antique oil paintings for the canvas, old frames for the old frames. He'd even fake old labels, fake photos to prove the provenance. You want to know how he finally got caught? It wasn't even his fault, if you can believe that. It was due to something that wasn't his fault. After paying millions of dollars for a painting, the client took it to be authenticated. And during the authentication, they found titanium dioxide white in one of the paints. Well, titanium dioxide white was not available back in the day. When Beltracci painted this, everything was listed. All the ingredients were listed on the tube except that one. They forgot to print it on there. He got caught. But I wouldn't feel too sorry for this guy. He served some time in a very easy prison. Now he's out, and he sells his paintings for about $45,000 a pop. Now, once again, I'm going to end the show with a controversial question that you can all discuss at dinner tonight. Now, before you all get pushed out of shape about this, I know this is very graphic. And I'll quickly start off by telling you that this painting is hanging in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, France, one of the most famous museums in the world. Furthermore, it does not have the fig leaf. I placed it there to cover it up so I wouldn't get thrown off the ship and I wouldn't offend you. Now, it's displayed in a very prominent area in the main gallery with a lot of other paintings of the period. It isn't in another room with warning signs for children. This was painted by Courbet in 1866, very famous artist of the day. This was Courbet's style of painting in 1866. He painted this during the same period. Let's compare the two styles, radically different. The best part I've covered with the fig leaf are very graphic, and it gets worse than you're imagining. Now, this is shocking to a lot of people when they come across it in the museum. We stood back and we watched people's reactions at the museum. They'd either stand there and look at it for a while, or they'd cover the kid's eyes and they'd walk down here, or they'd just walk right by it and ignore it. Well, there's a story behind the painting. I'm going to tell you the rest of the story. This painting was actually never meant to be seen by anybody, the general public. It was painted in 1866. It wasn't first displayed until 1990, 124 years later. Why is that? Because the painting was commissioned by a rich Turkish diplomat. This Turkish diplomat also commissioned other famous artists of the day to do similar paintings of realistic nudes. You see, it was his private collection of pornography. We didn't have Playboy magazines and digital cameras back then. This was his only way to amass a collection of porn. There's no other known example of this in art history today, according to the museum. Another interesting part of this story, the identity of the model. Remember Whistler's mother? The model under the fig is actually Whistler's mother. No, not. Just kidding. There's a thought for you. Experts actually think, though, that it's Whistler's girlfriend, not his mother. That was a joke. Whistler's girlfriend's name was Jo. This is a painting of her done by Courbet also. The same Courbet who painted the graphic nude. You see, Whistler and Courbet were really good friends until just after this painting was done. And then they had a really, really big fight. You see, the painting may have been the reason for the big fight because Whistler didn't want his girlfriend painted like that. He didn't want everyone to see that. The experts think that's proof that it was his girlfriend, Jo. They also think the proof is that when you take the fig leaf off, the hair is actually red too. Well, remember, too much information. Not too much information, because that was all given to us by the docent at the museum. It's part of art. So my controversial question to everybody here today, guys, do you think this painting should be part of the museum's exhibit of other famous paintings? Remember, it was never meant to be seen by anybody. It was 124 years. It also wasn't done, the original artist never did things like that, and it's a shock to everybody who sees it. Should it be removed, or should it be in an area with warning signs for parents with kids? I hope that'll be a good topic of discussion at dinner tonight because it's art. Now I want to ask you another question before I close here today. Did y'all enjoy this show? How'd I do? Oh look, the leaf fell off. You want me to back up? I didn't think you did. All right.